What if the golden rules of sales and persuasion that you've been taught your entire life?
Right, all the classics.
Yeah, exactly. Like asking open-ended questions or, establishing a tight timeline and just pushing relentlessly for the close. What if those are actually the exact things killing your biggest opportunities?
It's a terrifying thought, honestly.
It really is. Because, when we think about something like a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of absolute clinical precision. You break your arm, the x-ray shows this jagged white line, and the doctor points to it and says, there it is, a fracture.
Right, it's entirely binary.
Exactly. It's comforting. You know exactly what the problem is and exactly what the solution requires.
And we crave that visibility in business as well. I mean, we really do. We want clear-cut, universally applicable rules that just, guarantee a specific outcome if we just follow the script.
Right.
The assumption is that persuasion is this linear equation, like input the right words, output a signed contract.
But the moment you step into the world of complex, high-stakes persuasion, pitching a massive enterprise software solution or negotiating a multi-year partnership.
It's all trying to secure millions of venture capital, yeah.
Exactly. That diagnostic x-ray machine just completely shatters. We're no longer looking at a clean fracture. We're operating in these incredibly murky psychological waters.
Absolutely.
And the central tension we're unpacking today in this deep dive is it's a fascinating paradox, really. The tactical strategies that work brilliantly when you're selling something small or simple or cheap, they become dangerously toxic when the stakes, the price tag, and the complexity increase. What got you to the table in a simple transaction will actively sabotage you in a major one.
It really forces a complete recalibration of how we view human decision-making. And, for this deep dive, we are looking at the synthesized data from a massive 12-year study.
12 years. That's wild.
Yeah, and they analyzed 35,000 distinct sales calls. 35,000. This wasn't some theoretical exercise conducted in a university lab. This was granular, on-the-ground observation of how real professionals navigate the anatomy of a major transaction. And the data fundamentally dismantles the folklore of the hard sell.
So to understand why those traditional aggressive tactics fail so spectacularly in high-stakes environments, we really have to look at the underlying psychology of the major decision itself.
Right.
Because a major decision isn't just, a small decision with a few extra zeros attached to the price tag. It's a fundamentally different psychological event.
Totally different.
It's driven by two massive shifts in the buyer's mindset. First, the requirement of an ongoing relationship, and second, the sudden, just terrifying visibility of risk.
Let's isolate that first shift, the ongoing relationship, because in a conventional low-stakes transaction, the buyer can easily compartmentalize the product from the person selling it.
The source material actually uses a brilliant comparison that perfectly grounds this. It contrasts the experience of buying a $15 overhead projector with the experience of purchasing a $70,000 network computer system.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Right. So think about the projector. You walk into a store, or maybe you get a cold call from an office supply vendor, and the salesperson is just a walking cliche.
Oh, we all know the type.
Right. They speak a little too fast, they lean in a little too close, and they use these high-pressure, manipulative closing tactics. They're sleazy. Yeah. But the projector is $15, and you happen to need one for a presentation that afternoon.
Yeah, so the friction of the salesperson's personality just doesn't outweigh the immediate utility of the product.
Exactly. You endure the 5 minutes of high-pressure discomfort, you hand over the $15, you take the projector, and you walk away knowing with absolute certainty that you will never have to see or speak to that fast-talking vendor ever again.
Never again.
The transaction is a closed loop. You've cleanly separated the seller from the product.
But apply that exact same fast-talking, high-pressure dynamic to the $70,000 computer system. You are no longer buying a static piece of hardware that just sits in a closet.
No.
You're purchasing a months-long implementation process. You're signing up for weekly integration meetings, quarterly reviews, and, midnight troubleshooting calls when the server goes down.
Right. You're fundamentally incapable of separating the product from the seller.
Exactly. You're not making a purchase. You're entering into a corporate marriage.
And if that vendor uses a slick, aggressive closing technique on me while I'm evaluating a massive multi-year partnership, my defense mechanisms don't just flare up against the price tag. They flare up against the prospect of being tethered to this person.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, I'm sitting in the boardroom thinking, if this person is this manipulative and pushy when they're actively trying to win my business, what on earth are they going to be like to work with when things go wrong 6 months from now?
Right. The high pressure tactic doesn't just fail to close the deal, it actively repels the relationship. The psychology of the buyer in that moment shifts from evaluating the technical specifications of the system to evaluating the character and reliability of the human being across the table.
Makes total sense.
And when the stakes are high, the buyer's internal monologue is dominated by risk assessment. Which brings us to the second major psychological shift, the visibility of mistakes.
Oh, this part is so good. We all have what the text hilariously refers to as the shelf of useless gadgets.
Yes, the graveyard of terrible impulse purchases.
It's so painfully relatable. Like, you watch a late night infomercial, you get caught up in the hype, and you buy, I don't know, an automated vegetable dicer or a highly questionable ergonomic chair.
Right, and it breaks within 2 days, or it just fundamentally does not work.
Yeah, and what do? You shove it in the back of a closet. Or, you hide it in the depths of your departmental budget. It's a strictly private mistake. Your professional credibility isn't destroyed because you wasted $20 on a bad vegetable dicer.
Exactly, the psychological burden of that mistake is near zero. But scale it up to the corporate environment. Imagine you're a mid-level executive advocating for a massive company-wide software migration.
Nice stakes.
Very high. You champion the vendor. You convince the board to allocate hundreds of thousands of dollars. The entire company spends 3 months transitioning to this new system.
That fails.
And it fails. The software crashes, data is lost, operations just grind to a halt.
That is no longer a private mistake hidden in a closet.
Not at all. That is an incredibly public, highly visible disaster. It's the kind of failure that becomes office lore.
Oh, yeah.
It's the kind of mistake that follows you on your resume and can single-handedly derail a career. When a buyer is contemplating a major decision, the sheer terror of making a public career-damaging error becomes the dominant psychological barrier in the room.
Wow.
The purchase price is almost secondary to the fear of public humiliation and professional ruin.
So, knowing that the fear of public failure is sitting right there in the room with you, hovering over the negotiation table, how does that change the way you should behave?
Right.
Because if a seller knows the stakes are astronomical, their natural human instinct, which is, driven by their own anxiety, is usually to talk faster, push harder, and aggressively pitch the features of their product to artificially inflate its value.
But we just established that pushing harder when risk is high is a recipe for disaster.
Right. It makes the buyer feel cornered, and a cornered buyer does not sign a multi-year contract. So if we strip away the high-pressure close, what is the alternative roadmap?
Well, the researchers who analyzed those 35,000 calls needed to find a structural baseline. Before they could determine what made a call successful, they had to map the anatomy of how business interactions actually unfold.
Okay.
They distilled almost every professional encounter into 4 distinct sequential phases: preliminaries, investigating, demonstrating capability, and obtaining commitment.
Let's examine the mechanics of these 4 stages, because the way they manifest in the real world is entirely dependent on context. So, stage 1 is the preliminaries. These are the warming up events, the handshake, the small talk, the initial establishment of presence in the room.
It's the period of the interaction before the serious business officially commences. And the data shows an incredible variance in how crucial this stage is depending on the cultural environment of the meeting.
The source material offers a brilliant juxtaposition here. Imagine you're trying to finalize a deal with a rural banker in Kentucky.
Okay.
In that specific cultural and regional context, the preliminaries might consume 80% of your time together. It's an intricate, deeply ingrained social dance.
Right.
The banker wants to know where you grew up, who your family is, whether you follow the local college sports team, or if your uncle still keeps horses.
Yeah, you might sit in that office for an hour drinking coffee and never once mention the actual business proposition.
Exactly. The entire meeting is a relationship-driven sniffing out process.
The banker is using the preliminaries to gauge trustworthiness. In that environment, bypassing the small talk to rush into a business pitch would be perceived as deeply offensive and untrustworthy.
But contrast that Kentucky bank with the office of a high-volume buyer in the New York garment district.
Oh, this example is wild.
It is. The text describes a scenario in the garment district where a seller walks into a buyer's office and there are literally no chairs for the seller to sit down. None.
Wow.
And taped to the wall directly behind the buyer's desk is a massive handwritten sign that reads, "Spit it out and get out."
Spit it out and get out. It's a phenomenal example of environmental conditioning. In that context, time is the ultimate currency.
Yeah.
Engaging in 5 minutes of pleasantries about the weather or local sports would be perceived as a profound disrespect of the buyer's time. The spit it out sign is demanding that you compress the preliminaries into 5 seconds and immediately transition to the value proposition.
So the preliminaries are fluid. You adapt to the room. But once the pleasantries, or lack thereof, are concluded, we transition to the second stage, investigating.
Yeah.
This is the phase dedicated to asking questions, uncovering the buyer's needs, and mapping the internal landscape of their organization.
And once the investigation yields an understanding of the problem, you move to the third stage, demonstrating capability. This is the pivot where the seller finally presents their solution. You're no longer asking questions, you're showing how your product, service, or idea directly resolves the specific friction points you just uncovered during the investigation.
And finally, the summit of the mountain, obtaining commitment, the close,
The close.
the moment where you secure an agreement to advance the relationship or finalize the transaction. So we have preliminaries, investigating, demonstrating capability, obtaining commitment. Now, if you look at the last 50 years of corporate training, negotiation seminars, and just the sheer volume of business literature published, virtually all of the oxygen is consumed by that final stage.
Oh, entirely.
The entire culture of persuasion has been built around the mythology of the closing.
Always be closing. I mean, it's the mantra that has driven modern sales management. The underlying assumption has always been that if you're struggling to secure large contracts, it's because your closing technique is weak.
Right.
You aren't using the right psychological pressure points at the end of the meeting to force the buyer's hand.
But when the researchers actually crunched the data on those 35,000 calls, they discovered a reality that completely inverts that conventional wisdom.
The data revealed a massive structural divergence based on the size of the sale. In small, low-stakes sales, there was indeed a correlation between strong, repetitive closing techniques and a successful outcome.
Oh, really?
Yeah, if you push hard enough on a $15 transaction, the buyer will often capitulate just to end the interaction.
Just to make it stop.
Exactly. But in major sales, the complex, high-risk, multi-stakeholder decisions, the data proved conclusively that the investigating stage is the absolute kingmaker.
So the success of a high-stakes interaction does not hinge on how slick your closing line is.
Yeah.
It hinges almost entirely on how masterfully you investigate the problem before you ever mention your solution.
It dismantles the archetype of the aggressive, fast-talking closer entirely. The data shows that the highest performers in complex environments are not the ones who can flawlessly execute a presumptive close or an alternative choice close.
Right.
The highest performers are the individuals who spend the vast majority of their cognitive energy in the investigating stage.
I cannot emphasize enough how liberating that is for anyone who has ever felt a sense of dread about pitching an idea or closing a deal. You do not need to possess the aggressive, borderline sociopathic confidence of a movie salesperson to be wildly successful in high-stakes environments.
No, you really don't.
The practical mandate here is to radically reallocate your preparation time. Stop agonizing in the mirror over the exact combination of words you are going to use to ask for the money at the end of the meeting.
Yeah.
Instead, spend 80, maybe 90% of your preparation time architecting the questions you are going to ask to uncover the hidden realities of the other person's situation.
But the moment we establish that investigating, which is fundamentally the art of asking questions, is the most critical phase, we immediately collide with another deeply entrenched piece of communication dogma.
Oh, the sacred cow of question structure.
Yes.
The absolute supremacy of the open-ended question. I have sat through countless communication workshops, leadership retreats, and negotiation seminars, and they all preach the exact same gospel.
They do.
You must ask open questions, questions that require a long, expansive explanation because they encourage dialogue and reveal unexpected information. And conversely, you must strictly avoid closed questions, questions that can be answered with a simple yes or no, because they shut down the conversation and put the buyer on the defensive.
That binary framework, like open is good, closed is bad, has been the bedrock of communication theory since E.K. Strong published The Psychology of Selling in 1925.
1925.
Right. It is taught as an absolute, immutable law of human interaction. But the research team behind this massive study decided to subject that dogma to rigorous empirical testing.
Okay.
They didn't just ask salespeople what they thought worked. They placed observers in the rooms to track the exact grammatical structure of the questions being asked by top performers versus average performers.
So, if the 1920s dogma holds true, The observer should have found that the elite negotiators were painting these beautiful, sweeping conversational canvases with brilliant, open-ended questions, while the struggling rookies were interrogating clients with rigid yes-no questions. What did the actual data reveal?
They tracked 120 calls in a single company, specifically isolating the highest performing professionals in complex, high-tech environments, and the findings were entirely contrary to conventional wisdom.
Completely opposite.
Completely. The researchers found absolutely zero measurable statistical relationship between the use of open questions and the success of a major sales call. None.
Zero statistical correlation. Decades of communication theory, millions of dollars spent on corporate training, and it literally does not move the needle.
It gets even more astonishing when you look at the individual behavioral profiles of the elite performers. The observers documented cases where some of the absolute most successful professionals in the entire corporation asked zero open questions during an entire high-stakes meeting.
Wait, really? Not a single one?
Not a single one. Every question they posed to the buyer was grammatically structured as a closed yes or no question.
Wow.
And conversely, other top performers relied almost exclusively on open questions. There was no uniform pattern. The grammatical structure of the question had no predictive value regarding the success of the interaction.
So how is it possible that the entire professional world has been agonizing over phrasing questions to avoid a yes or no answer, and the data shows it doesn't matter? Why does the open-closed distinction fail so spectacularly in the real world?
Because the open-closed framework is obsessed with grammar, not psychology. It assumes that the mechanical structure of a sentence dictates the emotional response of the listener.
Right.
But human beings don't react to grammar, they react to relevance. The psychological power of a question does not reside in whether it demands a one-word answer or a 10-minute monologue. The power resides entirely in how deeply that question pierces the buyer's specific, critical pain points.
Okay, let's ground this in a scenario. Imagine I am meeting with a chief information officer to sell a massive cybersecurity infrastructure upgrade. If I follow the traditional training, I might ask a textbook open-ended question like, can you walk me through the historical evolution of your data storage architecture over the last 5 years?
Right, very standard.
It's perfectly open. It cannot be answered with a yes or no,
And
and it might get the CIO talking for 20 minutes.
But what is the psychological value of that 20-minute monologue? It's highly likely to be a rambling recitation of historical facts that does absolutely nothing to expose a vulnerability or build urgency. The buyer is just reciting a timeline. They aren't feeling any pain.
Now contrast that with the strictly closed question. What if I look across the table and ask, are you currently losing sleep over the fact that your legacy servers are actively exposing your customer data to international ransomware syndicates?
Oh, wow.
Right. That is a grammatically closed question. The CIO can answer it with a single word, yes. But the psychological impact of that single word is astronomical. You haven't just asked a question, you have detonated a psychological bomb in the room.
You really have.
You forced the buyer to confront an existential threat to their business and their career. The relevance of the threat completely supersedes the grammatical brevity of the answer.
So the practical mandate for anyone stepping into a high-stakes meeting is to immediately jettison the anxiety over open versus closed phrasing. Do not waste cognitive bandwidth trying to rephrase a potent, direct question into a meandering, open-ended prompt just to satisfy an outdated communication theory.
Yes, focus 100% of your energy on the surgical precision of the problem you are uncovering. A brilliant closed question about a bleeding wound is infinitely more persuasive than a polite open question about the weather.
But discarding the open-closed framework leaves a vacuum, right? If we aren't categorizing questions by their grammatical structure, how do we systematically map the investigating stage?
Exactly.
How do elite professionals consistently uncover those bleeding wounds without alienating the buyer? Well, the researchers didn't just debunk the old model. They analyzed the transcripts of the successful calls to identify the actual conversational architecture used by the top performers.
Okay.
And they discovered a highly specific, repeatable sequence of investigation. They codified this sequence into an acronym, SPIN, S-P-I-N.
The spin strategy. This is the absolute core engine of complex persuasion. It is the roadmap for navigating from initial ignorance to deeply felt urgency. Let's dissect this architecture, starting with the S.
The S stands for situation questions. These are the foundational inquiries made at the very beginning of the investigating stage to establish the baseline facts, the background context, and the current operational reality of the buyer.
Questions like, what kind of inventory management software are you currently running? Or how many remote employees do you have accessing the server on a daily basis? Or could you outline the organizational structure of your procurement department?
Precisely. You're gathering the raw data necessary to understand the board before you make a move. However, the research revealed a massive hazard associated with situation questions. While they are a necessary starting point, they are highly toxic if overused.
Right.
Inexperienced negotiators rely on situation questions as a psychological crutch.
Because asking for objective facts is safe. It doesn't require you to challenge the buyer or expose any friction. You can just sit there with a notepad, firing off 20 consecutive background questions, and feel like you are conducting a rigorous business meeting.
But consider the emotional experience of the buyer. Every situation question you ask fundamentally benefits you, the seller. It allows you to collect data, but it provides absolutely zero value to the buyer.
Yeah.
They already know how many remote employees they have. They already know what software they use. You are essentially forcing them to educate you on their own dime.
It's exhausting for them.
It is. If you subject a busy executive to an endless barrage of situation questions, you will rapidly drain their patience and erode your credibility. They will begin to feel like they're being interrogated by an unprepared auditor.
It is the exact same dynamic as arriving at a new specialist medical clinic and being handed a 12-page intake form.
Oh, I hate those.
We all do. You sit in the waiting room for 40 minutes, begrudgingly filling out your medical history, your emergency contacts, your dietary habits. You understand it's a necessary administrative hurdle, but you are not experiencing any healing.
No.
You are just doing paperwork. And if the doctor finally walks in, looks at your chart, and spends the next 20 minutes asking you to verbally repeat your address and your insurance provider, you are going to walk out.
The elite performers understand this dynamic perfectly. They ask the absolute minimum number of situation questions required to establish context. They do their homework beforehand so they don't have to waste the buyer's time with easily searchable facts.
Right.
And the moment they have a baseline understanding, they pivot away from neutral background data and move to the P in the set bind sequence: problem questions.
The transition from the intake form to asking the patient where it hurts.
Exactly. Problem questions are designed to actively explore difficulties, dissatisfactions, bottlenecks, and areas of friction within the buyer's current situation. You are intentionally shifting the emotional tone of the room from neutral observation to critical evaluation.
Okay, what does that sound like?
You ask things like, are you experiencing latency issues when your remote team tries to access the central server? Or how difficult is it to generate quarterly compliance reports with your current legacy software?
You're poking at the bruises. You are looking for the cracks in the foundation. Now, the research notes a fascinating divergence here between small sales and major sales. In a low-stakes environment, simply asking problem questions and uncovering a minor dissatisfaction is often enough to trigger a purchase.
Because the barrier to entry is so low. If a door-to-door salesperson asks you, are you tired of your kitchen sponges smelling like mildew? And you say, yes, actually that is annoying. The problem is minor, but the solution, a $3 pack of antimicrobial sponges.
It carries virtually zero risk.
Exactly. The minor problem is sufficient to justify the minor cost.
But apply that to the corporate environment. If I am the CIO and you ask me, is it annoying that your current software requires manual data entry for quarterly reports? I might say, yes, it's a hassle. It takes my team an extra few hours every month. You have successfully uncovered a problem.
Yeah.
But if you immediately jump in and say, great, my new enterprise software automates that entirely. It will only cost you $200,000 and require a 6-month company-wide training protocol, I am going to laugh you out of the room.
The scale of the problem just does not align with the scale of the proposed solution.
Not at all.
The friction of manual data entry is a minor ache. The $200,000 migration is an invasive, high-risk surgery. A rational buyer will always choose to live with a minor ache rather than endure the massive disruption of a major operational surgery.
This is the exact moment where average salespeople fail. They uncover a minor problem, they get overly excited, they prematurely pitch their massive solution, and they get hit with a brick wall of resistance. The buyer just says, it's not worth the hassle to switch.
And this is where the elite performers separate themselves. When a top professional uncovers a minor problem, they do not rush to offer a solution. They exercise immense patience.
Patience is key.
Very much so. They take that localized, seemingly manageable problem, and they transition to the I in the supine sequence. Implication questions.
Implication questions. This is the psychological crucible of the entire methodology. This is where the alchemy happens.
Implication questions are designed to take a problem that the buyer perceives as small, isolated, and manageable, and ruthlessly explore its broader operational, financial, and strategic consequences. You are forcing the buyer to confront the domino effect of their minor dissatisfaction.
Let's go back to the doctor analogy to visualize the mechanics of this. A patient walks in and says, "My right elbow has a slight ache when I lift things." That is the problem. It's localized. It's an annoyance.
Right.
An average doctor might just say, take some ibuprofen, or an aggressive surgeon might say, let's operate tomorrow. But the masterful diagnostician uses implication questions. They ask, does this ache in your elbow affect your grip strength? And if your grip strength is compromised, is that impacting your ability to safely pick up your toddler? Furthermore, if we don't address the underlying inflammation causing this ache today, what is the likelihood that it degrades into permanent, irreversible nerve damage within the next 6 months?
The doctor hasn't changed the physical reality of the elbow. The ache is exactly the same as it was when the patient walked in.
Exactly.
But the psychological weight of the ache has been exponentially magnified. It has evolved from a minor inconvenience into a terrifying threat to the patient's lifestyle and long-term health.
So how does that translate into the boardroom? Let's take the CIO with the annoying manual data entry. How do we use implication questions to magnify that minor hassle?
Well, the seller doesn't mention their software at all. Instead, they ask, you mentioned the manual data entry takes an extra few hours. Does that delay the finalization of the quarterly compliance reports? The CIO says, yes, usually by a day or two. The seller continues, if the compliance reports are delayed, does that ever trigger automated fines from the Regulatory Oversight Committee?
And the CIO shifts in their seat.
Right. Well, yes, we paid a minor penalty last quarter. The seller presses further. And if you're continually paying regulatory penalties, what impact does that have on the board's confidence in your department's operational efficiency, especially as you approach the upcoming budget allocation meetings?
Boom. You just bypassed the logical brain and went straight for the amygdala.
Straight for the fear center.
The CIO is no longer thinking about the annoyance of typing numbers into a spreadsheet. They are suddenly vividly imagining the board of directors slashing their departmental budget because they look incompetent. You have built a bridge of cognitive dissonance. You forced their brain to connect a seemingly innocuous present-day habit with a devastating future catastrophe.
The urgency in the room completely transforms. The problem has become heavy enough and painful enough to easily justify the massive cost and risk of the $200,000 solution. Right.
The text specifically highlights that implication questions are the most sophisticated, intellectually demanding, and impactful type of question in the entire professional arsenal.
They seem like it.
They require deep empathy, rigorous analytical thinking, and a profound understanding of the buyer's business ecosystem.
Yeah.
You have to be able to see the hidden fault lines in their organization that they themselves might be blind to.
But there is a massive psychological hazard built into the implication stage. If you execute it perfectly, you are dragging the buyer through a harrowing exploration of their own vulnerabilities, their hidden costs, and their potential failures. You are intentionally making them profoundly uncomfortable.
Yes.
And if you just leave them there wallowing in the realization that their department is bleeding money and their career might be at risk, they're going to become defensive, depressed, and entirely paralyzed by fear. You have dug them into a dark hole.
And a buyer paralyzed by fear does not make proactive, positive decisions. You cannot close a deal when the emotional atmosphere of the room is suffocating.
You have to pivot the psychology away from the pain and toward the light. You have to provide an escape route. And that is the function of the final letter in the framework. The N. Need-payoff questions.
Need-payoff questions. We have established the background facts. We have uncovered the friction. We have magnified the pain until it is unbearable. Now, we ask the patient to imagine what their life will look like once they are finally healed.
Precisely. Need-payoff questions ask the buyer to explicitly articulate the value, the usefulness, or the strategic utility of solving the problem you just magnified.
Okay.
You are transitioning the focus from the devastating consequences of failure to the positive outcomes of resolution. You ask things like, if we could completely automate that data entry process, eliminating the reporting delays, how would that impact your standing with the regulatory committee?
Right.
Or if your team got those 10 hours back every week, what strategic high-value projects could you reallocate that manpower toward?
The psychological mechanics of the need-payoff question are absolutely brilliant. It's essentially conversational inception.
Yep.
Notice what the seller is not doing. The seller is not aggressively pitching the features of their product. The seller is not standing up and saying, my software will save you 10 hours and make the board love you.
Because the moment a seller makes a claim, the buyer's natural skepticism engages. If I tell you my product will save you $50,000, your immediate internal reaction is, prove it. You are biased. You are just trying to sell me something.
But with a need-payoff question, you reverse the flow of information. You ask a carefully calibrated question that forces the buyer to calculate the benefits themselves.
Right.
If I ask the CIO, how much money would you save annually if we eliminated those regulatory fines? And the CIO does the mental math and says out loud, if we fix this, it would save our department roughly $50,000 a year.
They believe it implicitly because they said it. They generated the number based on their own internal logic. A need-payoff question gets the customer to actively pitch the benefits of the solution to themselves. It transforms the dynamic from an adversarial negotiation where you are pushing claims and they are resisting them into a collaborative environment where the buyer is actively constructing the business case for your product.
That's incredibly powerful.
It is. It dramatically reduces objections because the buyer is emotionally invested in the solution they just articulated.
So if we pull this all together, the Espedian progression is a masterclass in psychological manipulation, and I use that word in the best possible sense, meaning the skillful handling of a complex situation.
Yeah, navigation, really.
S, situation. Establish the baseline facts, but get out quickly before you bore them. P, problem. Uncover the localized areas of dissatisfaction and friction. I, implication. Ruthlessly explore the cascading consequences of those problems to build massive, undeniable urgency. N, need payoff. Prompt the buyer to articulate the specific value of solving the problem, effectively getting them to cleanse themselves.
That's the perfect summary.
The practical takeaway is to completely restructure how you plan for high-stakes meetings. Do not build a slide deck that just lists your features. Build a conversational architecture that patiently walks the buyer through the sense-bind sequence so they truly, viscerally feel the weight of their own need before you ever mention what it is you actually sell.
It's a profound evolution. You transition from being a fast-talking teller who pushes products to being an analytical investigator who diagnoses systemic issues.
Yeah.
But even if you master the SIM framework and flawlessly navigate the investigating stage, the interaction eventually has to reach its conclusion. You still have to navigate the final stage of the call, obtaining commitment.
Right.
And just as the investigating stage is fundamentally different in a major sale, the reality of the close is entirely different as well.
Right, because the sheer mechanics of a major B2B transaction prevent a traditional close. If you are selling a multi-million-dollar enterprise infrastructure, you are not walking into a first, second, or even third meeting and walking out with a signed contract and a deposit check.
No, never.
The decision requires legal review, board approval, budgetary allocation, and technical vetting. It is a multi-call, months-long process. You physically cannot close for an order in the early stages.
Which means we have to radically redefine what constitutes a successful outcome for a meeting. If you can't get a signature, how do you know if you are actually winning?
Exactly.
The researchers identified that the failure of traditional closing in complex scenarios stems from a fundamental misunderstanding of objectives. Salespeople were optimizing for the wrong outcome. To correct this, the researchers introduced a vital binary discussion between the two potential outcomes of a meeting: an advance and a continuation.
This distinction is the ultimate diagnostic tool for your own professional performance. Let's define the terms, starting with the advance. An advance is an outcome where the buyer agrees to take a concrete, specific action that physically moves the sale forward.
It requires an expenditure of energy, capital, or political risk on the part of the customer. It is tangible.
Okay, like what?
The client agrees to schedule a product demonstration for their engineering team. Or they agree to provide you with secure access to their internal data so you can run a diagnostic audit. They agree to bring their boss, the ultimate decision maker, to the next scheduled meeting.
An advance proves that the momentum is real. The buyer has skin in the game. Now let's look at the dark side of the coin. The continuation. A continuation is an outcome where the meeting ends with polite, enthusiastic, positive noises, but absolutely zero concrete action.
Like, we really loved your presentation today. You've given us a lot to think about. Let's keep in touch.
Or, This was incredibly insightful. We are going to review these numbers internally. Give us a call sometime next quarter to touch base.
You are definitely on our short list. We are very impressed with your team's capabilities.
It sounds so incredibly validating. I can't tell you how many times early in my career I walked out of a pitch room, got in the elevator with my team, and we were high-fiving each other because the client said, "We love this, let's touch base in Q3." We felt like we absolutely crushed it.
And that feeling of elation is exactly why continuations are so dangerous. They are a psychological trap.
Yes.
They provide the emotional validation of a victory without any of the actual mechanical progress. A continuation tricks inexperienced professionals into believing they are succeeding, which prevents them from correcting their strategy. They just keep having pleasant, non-committal meetings until the deal quietly dies of starvation.
The source material illustrates this trap perfectly by contrasting two specific salespeople from the study. Let's look at the tragedy of John C. versus the ruthless efficiency of Fred F.
Oh, this is a great case study. John C. represents the archetypal inexperienced rep. The researchers observed John during a meeting, and afterward, they interviewed him about his objectives. They asked John, "What were you trying to achieve today?"
And what did he say?
John replied, "Oh, I just wanted to make a really good impression and build the relationship."
Oof. The researchers then ask, did the customer agree to any specific actions? And John says, no, not today, but they really liked the slide deck, and they said we should meet again in a couple of months when their budget opens up.
John is experiencing the euphoria of a classic continuation. He is thrilled. He believes he is building a pipeline.
Right.
His manager probably looks at John's stagnant sales numbers and assumes John is just a week closer, who needs to memorize a new high-pressure closing script. But John's actual problem is much deeper.
He lacks situational awareness.
Exactly. He literally does not know the difference between a polite, socially mandated brush-off and an actual mechanical step forward in the sales process. He is confusing a friendly conversation with a business transaction.
Now, you contrast John with Fred F. Fred is one of the corporation's absolute top-tier performers. When the researchers interview Fred before a call and ask him about his objectives, Fred doesn't say anything about making a good impression. Fred says his singular objective is to get movement.
Fred operates with a binary, almost ruthless clarity. He insists that if a call is worth his time, the client must agree to a concrete action that pushes the sale forward. He demands in advance.
If Fred walks out of a meeting and the client spent an hour complimenting his brilliant presentation, praising his company's reputation, and telling him they'd love to chat again next year.
Fred views that meeting as a complete, unequivocal failure.
Yes. He does not care about the compliments. He cares about the leverage. If he didn't secure an agreement to a specific action, like a technical audit or a meeting with the CEO, he knows the momentum is dead.
Because Fred understands the fundamental physics of the Mater decision. He knows that corporate inertia is the strongest force in the universe.
It really is.
If a buyer doesn't commit to a concrete action while you are sitting in the room with them, the moment you leave, their attention will be instantly consumed by 100 other operational fires. The polite promise to touch base next quarter is just a socially acceptable way of maintaining the status quo without having to endure the awkwardness of rejecting you to your face.
Why do so many of us willingly accept the continuation? Why do we settle for the polite brush-off? I think it comes down to our own emotional vulnerability as professionals, pushing for an advance, saying, can we schedule the technical audit for next Tuesday? It requires you to risk a direct, unvarnished rejection.
Right.
The buyer might say, no, we aren't ready for that. That rejection hurts. It stings. Accepting a continuation like, let's touch base next quarter, it feels like a warm hug. It protects our ego. We allow the buyer to let us down easy, and we pretend it's a victory.
It is the path of least emotional resistance.
Okay.
The practical takeaway here demands absolute, unflinching honesty with yourself regarding your meeting objectives.
Yeah.
You must become ruthless in your self-assessment. Never, ever allow yourself to be sedated by positive strokes or polite compliments. A successful meeting is defined strictly, exclusively by whether the other party committed to a tangible, specific action that advances the relationship.
If they did not, the meeting failed.
Exactly. You must walk into every interaction knowing exactly what advance you are targeting, and you must have the courage to ask for it.
So when we pull all the way back and look at the macro view of this data, what is the grand synthesis? It completely obliterates the cultural stereotype of the manipulative, fast-talking closers sweating in a boiler room. The true art of complex persuasion has absolutely nothing to do with slick trickery, artificial pressure, or grammatical sleight of hand at the end of a pitch.
Not at all.
It is a deeply empathetic, incredibly patient, and rigorously analytical process.
It requires a fundamental shift in identity. You have to stop viewing yourself as a vendor whose job is to push a product and start viewing yourself as a diagnostic investigator whose job is to uncover and solve systemic problems.
By understanding how the terrifying visibility of risk alters the buyer's psychology, by dedicating the vast majority of your cognitive energy to the investigating stage, by abandoning the distracting myth of open versus closed questions, by mastering the spoon progression to build undeniable urgency, and by demanding concrete advances rather than settling for polite continuations, you completely transform your professional presence.
You become an invaluable partner.
Exactly. You become someone the buyer actively wants to navigate the risk with.
But as we look at the entire architecture of the spoon framework, it all hinges on one foundational premise, the existence of a problem.
Right.
We have established that uncovering and magnifying friction is the raw material of a successful major sale. But if we push this logic to its absolute limit, it raises a fascinating, almost paradoxical question.
What happens when the prospect is completely oblivious?
Exactly. What happens when you walk into the room and the prospect doesn't even realize they have a problem yet? They are perfectly content with their outdated systems. Or perhaps worse, what if they acknowledge a minor inefficiency, but their perception of the problem is so minuscule that they simply do not care enough to invest the energy required to fix it?
That is the ultimate test of persuasion. How do you take a tiny, hidden, almost invisible annoyance, a problem the buyer doesn't even care about, and mathematically magnify it until they realize they are sitting on a tipping time bomb? How do you create that initial spark of dissatisfaction out of thin air?
That's the real challenge.
Well, that process of psychological alchemy, the specific mechanics of taking a dormant need and evolving it into an active emergency, is exactly what we will be dissecting in our next deep dive into the evolution of customer needs. Because remember, that diagnostic x-ray machine is broken. The problems aren't going to illuminate themselves. You have to be the one to show them where it hurts. Until then, keep digging.
Companies spend like billions of dollars every year training their sales teams on this one specific skill.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, they write sprawling encyclopedias about it.
Right, and they make literal Hollywood movies centered entirely around it. It is so ingrained in the DNA of corporate culture.
Yeah. But what if the hard empirical data proves that this exact skill is, the number one reason you are losing your biggest deals?
It's a crazy thought, right?
It's a profound realization. I mean, it forces a complete reevaluation of how businesses interact with their clients.
Exactly. Because the data suggests that the very behavior we reward and train for in modern commerce might actually be actively sabotaging long-term success.
Right.
So, welcome to today's deep dive. We are exploring Chapter 2 of the groundbreaking source material, Spin Selling, by Neil Rackham.
Specifically, we're looking at the chapter titled Obtaining Commitment, Closing the Sale.
Yeah. And over the course of this discussion, you are going to learn why traditional closing techniques completely backfire in major sales.
We're going to redefine what a successful meeting actually looks like, too.
Right, discarding all those old metrics of success. And we will break down the exact four-step framework that elite performers use to secure commitment without, ever resorting to pressure.
Which is huge.
It is. This matters for anyone in business, consulting, entrepreneurship, or really any field requiring persuasion, because mastering this distinction is the dividing line between average players and top-tier professionals.
Totally. And to appreciate the magnitude of the research we're about to explore, we kind of need to understand the historical monolith that this chapter dismantles.
Right, the old school way of thinking.
Exactly. For over 60 years, conventional sales wisdom preached that closing was the undeniable climax of the sale. The consensus was built around the mantra, always be closing. The ABCs of selling.
Always be closing. It wasn't just a casual suggestion either.
No, it was an institutionalized religion.
The culture surrounding this was intense. I mean, you had entire training seminars dedicated to memorizing these tactics.
Oh, the tactics were everywhere.
Like the assumptive close, where the seller just bypasses the actual decision and asks, where would you like the system installed, before any agreement has even been reached.
Right. Or the alternative close. That's a classic one. Offering a choice between two positive outcomes for the seller, like, would you prefer delivery on Tuesday or Thursday?
Yeah, giving them no room to say no.
Exactly. Then you had the high-pressure ones, like the standing room only close, where you manufacture scarcity by claiming another buyer is, waiting in the wings to take the inventory.
And those techniques really formed the foundation of global sales training.
It did. And the interesting thing is, Neil Rackham and his research team at Huthwaite, they actually began their massive project fully intending to validate these methods.
Wait, really? They weren't trying to debunk it?
Not at all. They weren't contrarians looking to pick a fight with the establishment. They actually consulted the leading writers, veteran sales managers, and like the legendary trainers of the era.
Asking them what to study.
Yeah, they asked them where a $1 million research project should focus its energy. And the unanimous response was to study closing.
Because everyone just assumed that's what worked.
Exactly. The prevailing theory was that successful sellers simply closed more often and utilized a wider variety of closing techniques.
I mean, some of the most famous trainers at the time, like J. Douglas Edwards, they even quantified it.
Oh yeah, the 5 close rule.
Right. They taught that a salesperson hadn't fulfilled their fundamental duty until they had asked for the order at least 5 times in a single conversation.
Which is just exhausting to think about.
It really is. That level of persistence was viewed as the absolute hallmark of a professional.
So the researchers took that hypothesis into the field. They set up their first major study within a large office equipment corporation.
And the methodology was pretty straightforward, right?
Very straightforward. If the industry consensus was accurate, then sales calls featuring a high frequency of closing behaviors should yield vastly higher success rates than calls where the seller rarely closed.
Makes logical sense, if you believe the hype.
Right, so the team shadowed representatives and meticulously observed 190 sales calls. And they logged every single instance of a closing behavior.
Okay, let's unpack this. What did the data actually show? Because they isolated the extremes to see the contrast, right?
They did. They took the 30 calls where the sellers used the absolute highest number of closing techniques and compared them directly against the 30 calls where the sellers closed the least.
And the researchers were confronted with data that completely contradicted their expectations.
Completely. The 30 calls with the highest frequency of closing, where sellers averaged about 5.8 closing behaviors per interaction, resulted in a dismal success rate.
How dismal are we talking?
Only 11 of those 30 calls ended in a sale.
Wow, so that's roughly a 38% success rate.
Exactly. Conversely, the 30 calls with the lowest number of closes, averaging a mere 1.4 closing behaviors per call, resulted in 21 sales.
That is wild. That represents a 70% success rate.
It's staggering, right? The inverse relationship is just undeniably there.
But, you know, a skeptic looking at that initial data might argue that the causation is flipped.
How do you mean?
Like, they might say the sellers in those high close calls only resorted to using 5.8 closing techniques because the buyers were exceptionally resistant.
Ah, I see.
The assumption would be that it was just a tougher room, forcing the seller to work harder. Are we really saying that training people in classic closing techniques actually hurts them?
Well, the Huthwaite team anticipated that exact criticism. They understood that one observational study couldn't topple decades of entrenched dogma.
Right, they needed more proof.
Exactly. They needed to isolate the attitude of the sellers toward the concept of closing itself. So they deployed an attitude survey across 38 members of the sales force using a Likert scale.
Asking them to rate their agreement with deeply held industry beliefs.
Yeah, 15 specific statements. Things like, weak closing is the most common cause of lost sales, and you cannot close too often.
So they were basically looking for the true believers.
Right. They wanted to see if the people who championed the always be closing philosophy were actually outperforming the skeptics on an annual basis.
And what did the financial realities expose?
It was another devastating blow to the consensus. The sellers who exhibited a highly favorable attitude toward closing the true believers only achieved an average of 83% of their annual sales targets.
Ouch. And the skeptics.
The top performers, the ones who consistently exceeded their quotas, achieving an average of 104% of their targets, they actually scored unfavorably on the attitude survey.
So the individuals generating the most revenue actively disliked and avoided traditional closing techniques.
Exactly.
I mean, if I am a director of sales training in that era, this data is an existential threat.
It really is.
It suggests that the millions of dollars spent on teaching people to overcome objections and push for the close is not just wasted, but it's actively suppressing revenue.
And that exact scenario played out when the researchers presented their findings to a company that had just invested heavily in a customized intensive training program.
A program focused entirely on aggressive closing tactics.
Yeah. Yep. So the Huthwaite team proposed an intervention study to measure the real-world impact of this new curriculum.
Before and after the training.
Exactly. They established a baseline by observing 86 calls with a group of 47 sellers before they underwent the training.
And where were they at before the training?
At that point, the sellers were averaging about 3.2 closing behaviors per call, and they were operating at a very solid 64% success rate.
So the expectation from the company's perspective would be that this expensive new training would push that 64% success rate even higher.
Right. They teach them to close harder, the win rate goes up.
So what actually happened?
Well, the training was highly effective at changing behavior.
Mm.
When the researchers observed 128 calls with those same sellers after the program, the frequency of closing behaviors had surged.
From 3.2 up to what?
Up to 5.6 per call. The sellers were executing the training flawlessly.
About the success rate.
It collapsed. It plummeted from 64% down to 51%.
That is insane. By systematically teaching their sales force to close more frequently, the organization engineered a massive drop in their own sales performance.
They literally paid to lose deals.
So for anyone listening, the takeaway here is to immediately stop using closing frequency as a metric for effort or success in a complex environment.
Absolutely.
A manager listening to a call recording and telling a rep, "You didn't ask for the business enough times," is likely dispensing incredibly harmful advice.
It's toxic advice in complex sales.
Yeah.
But, the underlying mechanics of this failure are what we really need to understand.
Yeah, why do techniques that undeniably work in certain environments fail so spectacularly in others?
The answer lies in the psychology of decision-making. Specifically, how the monetary and psychological size of a decision alters a buyer's response to pressure.
Ah, decision size.
Right. And the researchers found an elegant way to test this variable in what became known as the photo store study.
Okay, tell me about this one.
So, a prominent chain of photographic equipment stores was rolling out a new closing training program. And the unique staffing policy of this chain provided the perfect control environment.
Because they rotated their staff, right?
Exactly. The store systematically rotated its sales staff between different departments on a daily basis.
So one day, a seller is stationed at a counter moving low-value consumables, like film, batteries, minor accessories that average about $15.
Right. And then the following day, that identical seller, possessing the exact same personality and training, is moved to the high-end counter.
Selling complex camera bodies and video equipment averaging over $100.
Exactly. This rotation completely isolated the variable of the product size.
So what did they track?
The researchers tracked transaction times, the frequency of closing techniques used, and the ultimate conversion rates.
Okay, let's look at the cheap stuff first. The low-value $15 goods.
The pre-training success rate for those items sat at 72%. After the staff completed the aggressive closing training, the researchers noted a sharp increase in closing behaviors.
And a decrease in transaction time, presumably?
Yes, a significant decrease in the average transaction time, and an increase in the success rate to 76%.
So in the context of cheap transactional retail, the training performed exactly as advertised. It accelerated the interaction and marginally boosted revenue.
It did. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, the breakdown occurred when those newly trained salespeople applied the identical techniques to the expensive $100 items.
The high-end equipment.
Right. Before the training intervention, they were successfully selling the high-end equipment at a 42% rate.
Okay.
Post-training, their closing behavior skyrocketed, and the average time spent with a customer dropped drastically, from 12 minutes down to 8 minutes.
But what about the success rate?
It cratered. It fell from 42% down to 33%.
Wow. So it's like buying a $15 multi-tool at an airport, which takes 2 seconds of thought, versus buying a $70,000 corporate accounting system where you have to work with the seller for months.
Exactly. The psychological weight is entirely different.
This data perfectly maps the psychological concept of pressure and resistance. When you are dealing with a small decision, the psychological cost of making a mistake is essentially zero.
Right, it's just $15.
Yeah. If a salesperson applies an assumptive close or pushes a bit too hard, the cognitive load required to stand there, push back, and argue with them is actually higher than the cost of just buying the item.
The path of least emotional resistance for the buyer is to simply comply, hand over the $15, and leave the store.
But as the stakes rise, that dynamic inverts completely.
It does. Think about your $70,000 software example. If you buy a bad $15 tool, you throw it in a drawer and forget about it.
Right.
If you advocate for the wrong $70,000 software, the implementation fails. Your entire department is disrupted, the CFO demands answers, and your professional reputation is damaged.
So the perceived risk of making a highly visible, expensive mistake triggers a massive defensive response.
Exactly. When a seller applies artificial pressure in a high-stakes environment, the buyer's survival instinct kicks in. The resistance to pressure becomes vastly stronger than the pressure itself.
That makes total sense.
Furthermore, the photo store study highlighted the inverse relationship between transaction time and value. Closing techniques are designed to force a conclusion, right? They inherently truncate the conversation.
Which is fine in a retail setting with foot traffic because faster transactions increase throughput.
Exactly. But in a major corporate sale, rushing a decision maker deprives them of the time required to perceive enough value to justify their immense risk.
So if you force a premature decision, the default answer must be no because the buyer hasn't gathered the necessary psychological safety to say yes.
You nailed it. You absolutely must tailor your strategy to the size of the commitment. What works for a $15 retail transaction is toxic for a $100,000 B2B contract.
And that toxicity doesn't just stem from the financial price tag either. It's also a reaction to the sophistication of the individuals authorized to make those large decisions.
Yes, professional buyers are explicitly trained to navigate these interactions.
Large capital expenditures involve procurement teams, senior directors, and specialized buyers who possess a really high degree of commercial awareness.
They instantly recognize traditional closing techniques, and they actively resent them.
The source material illustrates this dynamic with a fantastic anecdote about a senior buyer at British Petroleum. I love this story.
Oh, it's a great example.
So this individual didn't harbor a general disdain for salespeople, but he had a visceral hatred for closing techniques. He viewed them as an insult to his intelligence.
Right, an arrogant assumption by the seller that a professional buyer could be manipulated by a thinly veiled linguistic trick.
Exactly. He felt it undermined the entire foundation of mutual professional respect. So he developed a highly unorthodox, yet incredibly effective method for enforcing his boundaries during negotiations.
Tell them about the index cards.
Okay, so the author of the study was sitting in on a meeting where a supplier was pitching a massive order of plastic vending machine cups to this BP buyer.
The presentation is progressing nicely.
Right. And then the seller decides to deploy a classic assumptive close. He says, "You've agreed our cups are cheaper, so shall we make our first delivery of 20,000 next month?"
And what does the buyer do?
The BP buyer doesn't verbally object. He calmly opens his desk drawer, retrieves a small box of index cards, flips through them, selects one, and places it face up on the table.
And the card simply reads, in capital letters, assumptive close.
It functions exactly like a referee issuing a yellow card on a soccer pitch.
It's brilliant.
It is. The buyer looks at the salesperson and says, "That's your first chance. I give people two. If you use just one more closing technique on me, then it's no sale. Just so you know what I'm watching for, look through these."
And he hands him the whole stack.
He hands the seller the entire stack of index cards, each one detailing a different textbook closing maneuver.
I can only imagine the look on the seller's face.
He was completely disarmed, goes pale, and realizes he is dealing with someone who sees right through the theatrical performance. He abandons the closing tactics entirely for the remainder of the meeting.
While the index card method is extreme, the underlying sentiment is nearly universal among professional buyers.
Yeah, they don't like being played.
Not at all. The researchers actually distributed a questionnaire to 54 professional buyers across 3 large corporations to test this.
And what was the central question?
If you detect that a seller is using closing techniques on you, what effect does this have on your likelihood of buying?
And out of those 54 experienced buyers?
Only 2 indicated they were more likely to buy.
Just 2.
18 remained indifferent. And a staggering 34 buyers, the overwhelming majority, stated unequivocally that detecting a closing technique made them less likely to proceed with the purchase.
So when a seller uses a high-pressure close on a sophisticated buyer, it immediately signals a misalignment of priorities.
Exactly. It broadcasts, I am no longer focused on solving your complex organizational problem. I am focused on hitting my monthly quota.
The buyer realizes the seller is prioritizing their own timeline over the buyer's operational reality.
And the damage extends far beyond the immediate transaction. In major sales, signing the contract is rarely the finish line, right?
No, it's usually the genesis of a long-term implementation phase. The relationship is just beginning.
Exactly. So the researchers collaborated with the retail chain to study the hidden costs of closing on post-sale satisfaction. And the results provide a stark warning about the long-term viability of pressure tactics.
How did they set that up?
They tracked consumer goods purchases and then followed up with 145 customers between 3 and 5 days after the transaction.
Asking them what?
They asked these customers to rate their overall satisfaction with the product and to rate the probability that they would return to do future business with the store using a 10-point scale.
Okay, and then they segmented the data.
Yes, based on whether the customer was sold by a representative trained in aggressive closing or a representative who had received no such training.
And the disparity was alarming.
Very alarming. Customers who purchased from the trained closers rated their product satisfaction at only 5.8 out of 10, and their likelihood of returning to the store at a dismal 5.2 out of 10.
Wow. And the other group?
Conversely, the customers who interacted with sellers who did not use closing techniques reported a satisfaction score of 7.7 out of 10 and a likelihood of returning of 7.9 out of 10.
That is a massive deterioration in customer loyalty for the high-pressure group.
It is.
It really demonstrates that when an individual feels cornered or pressured into a decision, even if they ultimately needed the product, the psychological aftermath is severely tainted.
They experience a heightened state of buyer's remorse.
Right. The cognitive dissonance of acting under pressure makes them feel manipulated rather than feeling the autonomy of making a sound business choice.
If your business model relies on repeat business, long-term relationships, or post-sale implementation, traditional closing damages the very trust you need to succeed.
It degrades a potential win-win partnership into a predatory short-term transaction.
Exactly.
This brings us to a critical juncture for anyone listening to this analysis. We have thoroughly deconstructed the always be closing myth.
The data clearly shows that high-pressure techniques suppress conversion rates, insult sophisticated buyers, and destroy long-term post-sale satisfaction.
But, a very natural but dangerous reaction to this information is a complete pendulum swing.
Like doing nothing at all.
Yeah. So what does this all mean? Should the listener just sit there passively after pitching and hope the customer volunteers to hand over their money? A seller might hear this and conclude, if closing is manipulative, I will simply present my solution, answer their questions, and wait passively for the customer to volunteer their commitment.
That passive extreme is equally destructive. Relinquishing all leadership in the sales process is a fatal overcorrection.
So doing nothing is also a disaster.
Absolutely. The source material highlights a crucial study conducted alongside Bob Boyles at American Airlines that directly addresses this risk.
Okay, tell us about the American Airlines study.
They monitored 575 calls made by sales agents and analyzed the success rates based on the sheer number of closing behaviors.
And for the calls where the agents used absolutely zero closing behaviors, where they just presented information and stopped?
Disastrous. Those calls had a success rate of only 22%.
22%. So doing nothing is a fast track to failing out of the industry entirely.
Yes. However, what's fascinating here is that the calls that featured exactly one closing behavior achieved a phenomenal 61% success rate.
Wait, one close?
Just one. If the agents pushed it to 2 closing behaviors, the success rate began to decline. If they escalated to 4 closes, the success rate collapsed back below 20%.
So the data forms a perfect bell curve, peaking at a single request for commitment.
Exactly. You absolutely still need to obtain a commitment from the customer, but it cannot be a traditional high-pressure close. The commitment must be a logical next step.
This forces us to define what that single, highly effective close actually looks like. I mean, if we have spent the last half hour dismantling the assumptive close, the alternative close, and the standing room only close, how does an elite performer actually ask for the business without triggering all the negative resistance we just discussed?
Answering that requires a fundamental paradigm shift in how we define a successful meeting in a complex environment.
Right, because in a simple one-call retail environment, the outcome is entirely binary. The customer either buys the product, resulting in an order, or they walk out empty-handed, resulting in a no sale.
It is absolute. The transaction happened or it didn't.
But in major sales involving multiple stakeholders and a long procurement cycle, less than 10% of interactions result in an immediate order or a definitive no sale.
Exactly. The overwhelming majority of meetings end in an ambiguous middle ground. The real battleground is this middle space.
And the research strictly divides this space into 2 categories, advances and continuations. Average performers consistently fail because they cannot distinguish between the two.
Let's dissect these two concepts thoroughly, because this distinction is the operational core of the entire methodology.
Yeah, let's start with an advance.
An advance is defined as an event, an agreement, or an action that physically and demonstrably moves the sale forward toward a final decision.
So it necessitates an expenditure of energy, time, or political capital by the customer.
Exactly. Examples of an advance include a prospect agreeing to attend an off-site demonstration, running their technical director into the next meeting, providing access to proprietary internal data for an audit, or agreeing to run a pilot program of the software.
So every advance requires tangible effort from the buyer side. There is friction involved. The customer has to actually do something.
Yes. A continuation, conversely, occurs when the sale technically remains open, but the meeting concludes without any specific agreed-upon action to advance the process.
And it is almost always characterized by positive, polite noises from the buyer.
Oh, constantly. They offer compliments like, "This is a fantastic presentation, we really like what your company's doing," or "Leave this literature with us and we will be in touch."
Or the classic, "Let's definitely reconnect sometime early next quarter."
Right. The danger of a continuation is that it feels incredibly validating.
It does. Here's where it gets really interesting. If we look at this through the lens of human relationships, an advance versus a continuation is perfectly mirrored in the dynamics of early dating.
I love this analogy.
Think of it like dating. Imagine going on a first date. The conversation is pleasant, the atmosphere is great. At the end of the evening, the other person says, "This was so much fun, we should definitely hang out again sometime."
You go home feeling a rush of dopamine. You feel validated.
But logically, that statement means absolutely nothing. There is no concrete commitment. You are in a continuation.
The illusion of progress without the reality of it.
Exactly. An advance in that scenario would be the person saying, "I really enjoyed this. I'm going to pick you up on Thursday at 7 p.m. to try that new restaurant downtown."
It requires a schedule commitment.
Yeah.
It dictates a time and place, and it physically moves the relationship to the next stage.
Right. Inexperienced salespeople are constantly going on corporate dates, hearing the equivalent of, "We should hang out sometime," and rushing back to their sales managers to forecast the deal.
They report, "The client loved us. This synergy was amazing."
But when a competent manager asks, what specific action did they agree to take this week? The rep realizes they have absolutely nothing.
The source text actually provides a stark contrast between two salespeople selling heavy industrial pumping equipment to illustrate this exact failure of objective setting.
Okay, let's hear it.
First, we observe John, a relatively inexperienced seller. He prepares for a meeting with a new prospect, and if you ask John what his objective is, he will say something vague like, "I want to make a good impression and introduce our new product line."
So he delivers his presentation. The buyer nods, smiles, and says, "Very impressive machinery. Thanks for stopping by."
And John leaves the facility feeling victorious. He updates his CRM notes with a plan to touch base in a few months.
When John inevitably misses his quota, his manager might diagnose the problem as a failure to close.
But John's deficiency isn't a lack of closing vocabulary. John's fundamental error occurred before he even walked into the building. His stated objective was a continuation.
He set out to gather validation rather than secure action.
Exactly. Because he didn't know what specific advance he was aiming for, he had absolutely nothing to transition toward at the end of the meeting.
Now contrast John's approach with Fred, one of the top-performing veterans in the same organization.
Fred prepares for a similar initial meeting, but his objective is razor sharp. He states, "My goal today is to get the chief engineer to agree to fly to our manufacturing plant for a feasibility discussion."
That is a massive advance. It requires the customer to burn travel budget and dedicate 2 days of a senior engineer's time.
Right. But during the meeting, Fred realizes that flying the engineer out immediately is entirely unrealistic given the current level of interest.
So what does he do? Does he just give up?
No, because his mindset is anchored to securing an action, he pivots dynamically. Instead of settling for a polite continuation, he secures a different advance.
What's the new advance?
The buyer agrees to arrange a dedicated technical meeting between Fred and their internal hydraulics specialist next Tuesday.
Nice. So Fred measures the success of his call entirely by the physical momentum it generated, paying zero attention to the polite compliments the buyer offered. For you, the listener, this requires a ruthless audit of your own calendar and meeting preparation. If you look at your schedule for tomorrow and the written objective for a meeting is to gather information or build rapport or check in, you are architecting a continuation.
You're planning to fail slowly and comfortably.
Yes. Never set a goal to build a relationship. Always plan for a specific advance. A professional never enters a room without identifying the highest realistic advance they intend to propose. What exact physical action do you want the stakeholder to agree to by the time the hour is up?
And recognizing the absolute necessity of the advance leads us directly to the mechanics of execution.
We have established that high-pressure closing destroys trust and that passive inaction loses the deal. We know the goal is a concrete advance.
So how do the elite top performers orchestrate the conversation to obtain that commitment smoothly? The researchers codified a highly specific four-step methodology that successful salespeople utilize to secure major sales without ever resorting to manipulation.
This four-step framework is the operational playbook. Let's analyze step one.
Step 1 often catches people off guard in a discussion about closing because it focuses entirely on the beginning of the interaction.
Okay, what is it?
Step 1 is give your primary attention to the investigating and demonstrating capability stages of the call.
So the secret to closing effectively is mastering what happens 45 minutes before the close is even mentioned.
Exactly. The empirical data showed that top-tier performers spend significantly more time in the investigation phase than average sellers.
Why is that?
They understand a foundational truth of human psychology. You cannot obtain a high-stakes commitment unless the customer clearly and urgently perceives a massive gap between their current situation and their desired outcome.
Build the needs so thoroughly during the first part of the meeting that the customer practically closes themselves.
Yes. If a seller does an extraordinary job of asking the right diagnostic questions, exploring the financial and operational pain of the customer's current reality, and building the need thoroughly, the customer practically demands the solution.
It's the difference between pushing a boulder uphill versus clearing the path for it to roll down. I mean, if you walk into a burning building, you don't need to use an assumptive close to convince the owner to buy a fire extinguisher.
That's a great analogy.
The overwhelming urgency of the problem does all the heavy lifting for the transaction. If a salesperson finds themselves having to push and strain and apply pressure at the end of a meeting, it is almost always a symptom of failing to properly investigate and magnify the problem during the first half of the call.
Which transitions seamlessly into step 2. Check that key concerns are covered.
Okay, unpacking step 2. What does that look like?
In a complex B2B environment, solutions are rarely perfect fits right out of the box. As a meeting nears its conclusion, the buyer will inevitably harbor lingering doubts, technical confusion, or unvoiced anxieties about the implementation.
And the traditional training methodologies taught salespeople to view these doubts as objections to be defeated.
Right. They advised using a hard close specifically to flesh these objections out into the open. The tactic was to aggressively say, "Sign the contract today," fully expecting the buyer to defensively shout, "Wait, we haven't even discussed the data migration protocol."
That approach instantly establishes an adversarial dynamic. The buyer feels cornered by the premature demand for a signature, so their concern manifests as a defensive weapon.
They are attacking the seller's pushiness rather than inquiring about the product.
So how do top performers avoid this tension?
Top performers avoid this entirely by taking the initiative. Instead of using a close to force an objection to the surface, they take the initiative and ask voluntarily. Before they attempt to bring the call to any sort of conclusion, they proactively and transparently ask.
Like, are there any areas of the implementation you feel I should tell you more about?
Exactly. Or, is there anything regarding the timeline that you are still unsure of?
The phrasing there is incredibly deliberate. By inviting the concern voluntarily, it transforms a potential conflict into a collaborative troubleshooting session.
It signals to the buyer, we are on the same side of the table trying to solve this together, rather than, I am trying to trap you into an agreement.
And once the buyer airs their concern and the seller addresses it honestly, the emotional friction evaporates.
Right. And with the path cleared of unvoiced anxieties, the seller moves to step 3. Summarize the benefits.
Bring all the complex threads of a multi-hour or multi-call discussion into a clear, focused summary.
Yes. In a major corporate sale, a single meeting might easily stretch to 2 hours. The conversation might have navigated through a maze of technical specifications, strategic overviews, financial ROI projections, and deployment schedules.
It is a biological certainty that the buyer does not have a crisp, organized mental framework of all that value floating in their short-term memory.
Right. Cognitive load theory dictates that the buyer is likely overwhelmed by data points. If you ask for a massive commitment while their brain is processing a dozen scattered variables, they will hesitate simply out of confusion.
So to counteract this, elite salespeople take on the burden of synthesizing the complexity.
They weave together all the disparate threads of the conversation into a concise, powerful summary. They selectively highlight only the specific benefits that directly address the most urgent needs the customer acknowledged during the investigation phase.
It operates precisely like the closing argument in a complex legal trial. A brilliant trial lawyer does not introduce new forensic evidence during their closing remarks. That would confuse the jury.
Exactly. Instead, they curate the most compelling, already established facts.
Right, organizing them into a clear narrative so that the value of their case is front of mind when the jury enters deliberation. The seller is crystallizing the value just moments before requesting the advance.
Which brings the entire process to its culmination in step 4. Propose a commitment.
The verb selection here is the most critical element of the framework. Top performers do not ask for the order. They do not demand a signature.
No, they propose an appropriate, logical next step. They use language like, given the bottlenecks we've identified in your current inventory system and the timeline you need to hit for Q3, I suggest the most logical next step would be for your operations director to come see our platform running live at our facility next week. How does that sound?
That phrasing completely redefines the power dynamic. A proposal implies a partnership between equals. It suggests a shared journey toward a solution, rather than unilateral demand from a vendor to a target.
It really does. But, this raises an important question. How do you know what to propose?
Yeah, how does a seller accurately calibrate what to propose? If the proposal is too aggressive, it triggers the resistance we discussed in the photo store study.
And if it's too timid, it devolves into a continuation.
So what's the rule?
The proposed commitment must rigorously meet 2 criteria. First, it must be a genuine relationship. It must require an action that physically progresses the deal.
Okay, and the second?
Second, and crucially, it must be the highest realistic commitment the customer is structurally and psychologically capable of granting at that specific moment in time.
Highest realistic commitment. You cannot ask a buyer to exceed their own internal authority.
Precisely. If you are meeting with a mid-level IT manager who has been tasked with researching solutions, proposing that they sign a $50,000 procurement contract is wildly unrealistic.
It forces them to say no, embarrassing them by highlighting their lack of authority.
However, proposing that they arrange a joint meeting between you, them, and the VP of IT, who holds the budget, that is a highly realistic, incredibly valuable advance.
Top performers constantly assess the organizational landscape to ensure they are asking for a stretch, but never an impossibility.
Exactly.
When we assemble these disparate pieces and view the entirety of Chapter 2 from a high vantage point, the underlying philosophy is profoundly empowering, even if it requires discarding decades of muscle memory.
It really is a complete 180 from the old way of doing things.
Yeah. In the realm of major sales, high-stakes consulting, or complex negotiations, success is absolutely not derived from verbal gymnastics. It's not about tricking someone into saying yes at the end of a pitch.
It isn't about maintaining a relentless, aggressive posture or asking for the business 5 times until the buyer submits out of exhaustion.
It is the systemic, methodical construction of value. Closing isn't a dramatic event. It's the natural, frictionless progression of a well-investigated relationship.
Obtaining commitment shouldn't resemble an adversarial showdown. The seller uncovers the operational pain, ensures the buyer feels the true weight of that reality, clears away lingering anxieties, summarizes the path forward, and then logically proposes a mutually agreed-upon step forward.
It elevates the entire profession. It transitions closing from a predatory act of manipulation into an act of professional collaboration. And as the immense volume of data from Huthwaite proves, this is not just a more ethical way to operate. It is the only statistically viable way to secure and maintain major accounts in a sophisticated market.
The data is clear on that.
So, to you, the listener, I issue a challenge based on everything we have covered today. Look at your calendar for the next week. Look at the meetings you have scheduled with prospects, existing clients, or even internal department heads.
Really scrutinize them.
Are you currently planning for warm, fuzzy continuations? Are you aiming to simply deliver a presentation, gather compliments on your slide deck, and leave with a vague promise to keep in touch? Or are you ruthlessly architecting specific, measurable advances?
Do you know the exact, realistic physical action you're going to propose before the meeting even begins?
Because the reality is, if you enter a negotiation without a clear advance in mind, you have forfeited the outcome before you even shake hands. But if high-pressure closing isn't the key to these large sales, what exactly are top performers doing during that crucial investigating stage we discussed in step 1 to make customers practically close themselves?
What is the actual diagnostic framework they use to uncover problems the buyer didn't even know they had?
We'll uncover all of that in chapter 3. What if the very buying signals you've been taught to look for, like the ones that practically guarantee a win when you're closing a small deal, are exactly what will completely kill your chances in a major negotiation?
Well, they absolutely will. It's basically the ultimate trap.
Right, because picture this. You're sitting across from a prospect, you ask a few discovery questions, and they lean back and admit, yeah, we're actually pretty unhappy with our current software system. It's slowing us down.
Which sounds great, right?
Exactly. Every instinct, every bit of traditional advice out there tells you to just pounce on that. It feels like this massive green light. You want to immediately jump in and say, oh, we can fix that right now with our platform.
But the data shows that doing exactly that is, well, it's a fatal mistake.
Yeah, and that's exactly what we are getting into today.
Right, so for this deep dive, we're looking closely at Chapter 3, specifically pages 62 to 74 of Neil Rackham's research. We're going to explore this critical psychological shift in the buyer's mind from, having a vague annoyance to an urgent mandate, and we'll introduce the first half of this MPN strategy. For anyone in business or entrepreneurship, understanding this shift is basically your ultimate shortcut to preventing objections before they even happen.
Which is huge, because then you don't have to rely on those really cheesy, high-pressure closing tactics that nobody likes anyway.
Nobody likes them, and in a big deal, they just don't work.
So before we even get into the tactics, I just have to say I am genuinely fascinated by the sheer scale of the research behind this. I mean, they analyzed over 35,000 sales calls.
Yeah, 35,000. It's wild to even think about the logistics of that.
I know. I just imagine researchers literally sitting in the corner of these tense boardrooms with clipboards and stopwatches, analyzing every single utterance. I mean, having that much data has to fundamentally change your understanding of human behavior.
Oh, completely. It shatters a lot of myths.
So what was the very first major crack they found in the traditional advice? Because, all the old school training basically says, find the pain point, and the moment they admit the pain, you pitch the cure.
Well, the first major crack was that we had a complete misunderstanding of what a pain point actually is.
Really? How so?
The researchers realized that they had to split these pain points into two completely different categories based on how they affect buyer behavior.
Yeah.
And it totally depends on the size of the sale. So they call these two categories implied needs and explicit needs.
Okay, let's break those down. What exactly is an implied need?
So an implied need is basically a statement from a customer about a problem, a difficulty, or some kind of dissatisfaction with the status quo.
Give me an example.
Like if they say, our data transmission is too slow, or, I'm really frustrated by the current error rate on the assembly line.
Got it. So it's essentially a complaint, like they are just venting a frustration.
Exactly. They are expressing dissatisfaction. Now, here's the tricky part. In a small, simple sale, an implied need operates exactly the way we've always been taught.
It's a buying signal.
Right. It is a highly accurate buying signal. If you're selling a low-cost item, say, I don't know, a new ergonomic mouse, and the customer says, my wrist really hurts when I use this old mouse, and you immediately offer them the new one for $20, you're probably going to make that sale.
Sure, because $20 is nothing to fix a sore wrist.
Exactly. But the problem is that, human beings are basically pattern-matching machines. We take that success from the small transaction, and we just assume the psychology scales up linearly.
We assume buying a $1 million server works the same as buying a $20 mouse.
Yes, and it absolutely does not. In a major sale, like a high-stakes, high-value transaction, the data show that implied needs are completely useless as predictors of success.
Wait, completely useless?
Statistically, yes. The absolute top performers in large sales, they do not treat a customer's complaint as a buying signal. Instead, they look for those explicit needs.
Okay, so if an implied need is just a complaint or a statement of a problem, how did the research define an explicit need? What's the actual shift there?
An explicit need is a clear, undeniable statement of a customer's want or desire for a specific solution. It's the transition from, stating a negative to demanding a positive.
I'm trying to map this to everyday life just to make it super concrete. It feels like the difference between someone sitting on the couch saying, man, I'm hungry, versus them standing up and saying, I need to order a large pepperoni pizza right now.
That is a perfect analogy.
Because I'm hungry is the implied need. Right, it's just a statement of a biological problem, but it leaves room for you to, I don't know, wait an hour or maybe just grab an apple out of the fridge later.
Right.
But I need a pizza right now is an actionable mandate. So it sounds like the danger for the average professional is treating the I'm hungry statement as if it's the mandate.
And taking that pizza analogy just a step further, think about the urgency and the commitment that's required. The leap a seller has to force is getting the buyer to demand the outcome rather than just merely acknowledging the discomfort.
So how does that play out in the real world, like in a corporate setting?
Well, the source text gives a fantastic example from the telecommunications industry to illustrate just how devastating it is when sellers get this wrong.
Oh yeah, the telecom example. Walk us through that.
So the researchers tracked this inexperienced seller who was sitting with a potential enterprise client. And during the conversation, the client just casually mentions, yeah, we have a capacity problem during our morning peaks.
Which is by definition a textbook implied need.
Completely. And this inexperienced seller, hearing this problem, immediately categorizes it in his mind as a buying signal. You can just imagine the adrenaline hit.
He's like, bingo, I've got the exact solution for this.
Exactly. He rushed right in, totally interrupted the flow of discovery, and pitched his whole network solution. And ultimately, he lost the business.
Because he treated this vague, localized complaint as a demand for a massive, expensive infrastructure overhaul. He just pounced.
Right. He pounced on raw clay instead of waiting for it to be fired into a brick.
But the text contrasts this guy with a top performer in that exact same telecom company, right? How did she handle that exact same trigger?
So when this top 5% performer heard a customer raise a very similar capacity problem, she held her fire. She did not jump in with a pitch, even though she had the exact same product in her bag as the other guy.
That takes so much discipline.
It really does. And when the researchers pulled her aside later and asked if she viewed those types of problems as buying signals, she explicitly said no. She explained that she needed to, in her own words, go back and develop them more.
Develop them. I love that phrasing.
Right. She wasn't listening for complaints. She was waiting for actions. She was waiting for the client to finally say, we need a system that can handle a 20% spike at 9 a.m. without crashing.
You know, it's like going to a physical therapist for a stiff neck. If I walk in and say, hey, my neck hurts when I turn to the left, that's the implied need.
Yep.
If the therapist immediately says, great, I'm going to schedule you for a $50,000 spinal fusion surgery tomorrow morning, my defenses are going up instantly. Like, I am running out of the clinic.
Oh, for sure. You'd think they were crazy.
Right. I need that therapist to do the mobility tests, find the pinched nerve, ask me how it's affecting my sleep, and basically make me realize how much quality of life I'm losing before I would ever agree to an MRI, let alone invasive surgery.
Exactly. Because the human brain intuitively rejects massive interventions for undeveloped problems.
Yeah.
Pitching a major solution too early, based merely on an implied need, it creates this immediate, almost biological resistance in the buyer.
It's like a flinch reaction.
It is. A complaint, a difficulty, an implied need, these are not signals to pitch. They are simply raw material. Like I said, they're the clay that a skilled negotiator has to mold and develop further.
But wait, if a minor complaint isn't enough to justify a massive purchase, what is actually happening in the buyer's head when they say no? Because going back to that telecom example, they did actually have a capacity problem, right?
They did.
And the rep did actually have a solution. So why would the buyer reject something that literally solves their problem? It can't just be about the money.
Oh, it's absolutely not just the money. The source text explains this rejection through a really powerful psychological framework. They call it the value equation.
The value equation. Okay, how does that work?
It's basically a scale that exists in the subconscious of every single buyer, whether they realize it or not. On one side of the scale, you have the seriousness of the problem, and on the other side, you have the cost of the solution.
Okay, so let's go back to my $15 ergonomic mouse example. In a small sale, the cost of the solution side of the scale is incredibly light.
Super light.
It's literally just $15 and maybe a 10-minute trip to the store. So a minor annoyance, like my wrist hurting a little bit at the end of the day, is heavy enough on the seriousness of the problem side to tip the scale. The annoyance outweighs the $15, so I buy the mouse.
Exactly. The transaction is totally frictionless. But in a major sale, the cost of the solution side of the scale becomes extraordinarily heavy. And this is where inexperienced sellers completely miscalculate, because they look at the word cost and they only see the invoice.
They just see the price tag.
Right. They see a price tag of, say, $50,000, and they think, well, their company makes $50 million a year. They can easily afford $50,000. But they are completely ignoring all the hidden costs of a major corporate decision.
You're talking about, like, the political capital and the implementation friction, aren't you?
Exactly. The hidden costs are staggering. Think about it. If a mid-level director champions a massive new software migration, they are putting their professional reputation on the line.
Oh, 100%.
What if the integration fails? What if it causes a weekend of downtime and the CEO notices? There is this immense risk of making a highly public mistake.
And then there's just the hassle factor of dealing with people.
Yes. They have to retrain 200 employees. They have to rewrite standard operating procedures. They have to deal with the inevitable pushback from staff who just hate change. All of that anxiety, all of that political risk, that all sits on the cost of the solution side of the scale.
I think about it in terms of my own tech stack.
Right.
Like, I am perfectly willing to spend a few bucks on a new app on my phone to solve some minor calendar glitch. It takes 5 seconds to download, and if it sucks, I just delete it.
Right, zero risk.
Exactly. But I would never spend $50,000 and risk my entire career to solve a calendar glitch of the exact same size for an entire enterprise organization. The psychological safety of just keeping the status quo is incredibly strong. You know the old saying, nobody gets fired for sticking with what we have.
Which forces a very uncomfortable realization for anyone in sales. If the cost of your solution is really that heavy, financially, politically, emotionally, then the original minor problem the customer casually mentioned is never going to be heavy enough to tip the scale on its own.
So a simple implied need just cannot overcome the sheer gravity of a major corporate disruption.
Never. Therefore, the problem must be artificially grown by the seller.
Artificially grown. I love that. We have to literally add weight to the seriousness of the problem side of the scale until it vastly outweighs the cost, the risk, and the hassle.
Exactly.
So before you even think about opening your slide deck or introducing your brilliant service, you have to ask yourself a really hard question. Have I made the customer's problem feel heavier than the immense risk of adopting my solution? And if the honest answer is no, you basically have to keep your mouth shut.
Which brings us to the actual methodology. Because the obvious question is, how do you actually grow a problem without coming off as manipulative?
Right, because nobody wants to feel manipulated.
Exactly. How do you take a passing complaint and turn it into a burning, explicit mandate for change? And this is the core of the SPIN strategy.
Okay, let's get into SPIN.
SPIN is an acronym for a specific, scientifically backed sequence of questions that are used by those top performers to build that weight we just talked about. And it begins with the letter S, situation questions.
Okay, let's get into the mechanics of this. Situation questions. From reading the research, these are basically the fact-finding background questions, the baseline data gathering,
All right.
things like, what equipment are you currently using? Or how many people do you employ in this division? Or how long have you had this specific architecture in place?
Yes. And here's where the Huthwaite research drops a deeply counterintuitive, almost alarming finding for traditional sellers.
Oh, I know where this is going.
The researchers discovered that situation questions are actually used more in calls that fail.
Wait, really?
Yes, failed sales calls contain a significantly higher volume of situation questions than successful calls. They're massively overused by inexperienced negotiators.
See, I'm looking at this data, and I honestly have to push back here a little bit.
Go for it.
Because I am struggling with the practical reality of this. If I'm a consultant or a software vendor, I have to know the facts to help my client, right? I can't just fly blind into a boardroom and start philosophizing about their pain.
Of course not.
If I don't know what tech stack they are using or how many user licenses they need or what their current supply chain looks like, how can I possibly recommend a tailored solution? Finding out their situation seems like the literal prerequisite to doing my job.
And your instinct to gather context is completely valid. But we have to look at this through the psychology of the buyer. Why do situation questions actively contribute to failure when they are overused?
Why?
Because they inherently benefit the seller, not the buyer. From the buyer's perspective, sitting through a barrage of data-gathering questions is incredibly fatiguing. They are not learning anything new about their business while you ask them how many square feet their warehouse is.
Oh, wow. Okay, yeah. I have been on the receiving end of that meeting, and it is genuinely excruciating.
It's the worst, right?
It feels like being interrogated by a lazy detective who hasn't even bothered to read the case file. You're sitting there, and the vendor says, so, you are headquartered in Chicago. and your primary product is industrial HVAC units, and you have 3 distribution centers.
And you're just rolling your eyes.
I'm sitting there thinking, yes, literally all of this is on the first page of our website, and we covered it in our Q3 earnings call. Why are you burning my valuable time making me educate you about my own basic reality?
Exactly. You are draining the buyer's patience before you even get to the core issues.
Yeah.
Every single time you ask a situation question, you are making a withdrawal from the client's goodwill account.
That makes perfect sense.
And in today's information age, the tolerance for this is lower than it has ever been. There is absolutely no excuse for asking a buyer basic facts that you could have found on LinkedIn through a quick Google search, or even just by having a 5-minute preliminary call with a junior staff member.
So it's not that you don't need the information, it's that asking the executive to be your human encyclopedia is insulting. You just have to do your homework beforehand.
Precisely. You should only ask the situation questions. Questions that are absolutely essential to set up a specific problem that you already know you can solve.
Give me an example of doing that right.
So if you know your software helps companies manage remote workforces, you don't walk in and ask, do you have remote workers?
Right, because you should already know that.
Exactly. You check their job postings, see they're hiring remotely, and say, I noticed you're shifting to a heavily remote workforce across 3 time zones. You establish the situation quickly, proving you've done the work, so you can immediately move to the P and spin.
Which is problem questions, the second phase of the sequence.
Yes, problem questions.
And this is where we pivot from gathering facts to actually probing for difficulties, dissatisfactions, and pain points. So instead of asking how many machines they have, we start asking things like, are you worried about the quality of the output from those older machines? Or is this current manual data entry process causing bottlenecks for your team?
Spot on. And unlike the baseline fact-finding, the research shows a direct positive correlation here. Successful calls have significantly more problem questions.
So more is actually better here.
Yes. These questions are the essential engine for uncovering those implied needs we discussed earlier. You simply cannot find the raw material of a problem if you don't ask questions specifically designed to unearth it.
You know, I noticed a really fascinating nuance in the source text regarding how these problem questions are perceived, depending on the environment.
Well, the cultural aspect.
Yeah. The text mentions Masaki Imai and his work adapting these sales models for the Japanese corporate environment. It turns out that in certain cultures, asking direct problem questions can be perceived as deeply insulting or even combative.
It's a brilliant point. The underlying implication of a problem question can be really threatening to a buyer's ego, especially when you are speaking directly to the person who is responsible for the system you are questioning.
Right.
Think about it. When you look at a senior executive and ask, are you experiencing difficulties with your current logistics operations? It can inadvertently be heard as, are your operations flawed because of your poor leadership?
Or, are you doing a bad job running your department?
Exactly.
Which instantly triggers a massive defensive wall. If you ask a VP of engineering if their code is buggy, their immediate instinct is to say, no, it's totally fine, we have it under control. Even if their servers are literally on fire in the next room, they want to save face.
And this really highlights why immense tact is required. You cannot simply cross-examine a buyer about their failures. You have to ask problem questions with empathy, utilizing third-party framing or industry trends to soften the blow.
Soften the blow, yeah.
You want to align with them against an external problem rather than making them the source of the problem.
Like saying, you know, a lot of directors in your sector are telling us that supply chain delays are wreaking havoc on their Q4 projections. How is your team insulating yourselves from that?
Perfect framing.
You frame it as an industry-wide storm and ask how their boat is weathering it, rather than just bluntly asking if their boat is sinking.
Yes, exactly.
So problem questions are great. They take a lot of tact, but they are the engine of discovery. They pull those implied needs out into the open. But as we move through the text, a massive warning sign appears.
A huge warning sign.
The research indicates that while problem questions are incredibly powerful and highly predictive of success in small deals, their overall power actually diminishes in major sales. And this, right here, sets up the ultimate trap that kills so many large deals.
This is the crux of the entire deep dive today. It is what the researchers codified as the contortomat trap, which is named after a specific dialogue example analyzed in the text.
The contortomat trap.
Yes. And it perfectly illustrates why the traditional formula of find a problem, offer a solution, completely self-destructs when the stakes get high.
Let's dissect this trap step by step, exactly as it happens in the real world.
Okay, well, let's do it.
Let's say you are selling a massive $1 million automated manufacturing system. You sit down with the plant manager. First, you follow the model and ask a situation question. You say, do you use contortomat machines in this division?
Right.
The buyer, answering the factual question, says, yes, we have 3 of them. Then you move to your problem question. Are they difficult for your operators to use?
And the buyer thinks for a second?
And responds with an implied need. They say, yeah, they are actually rather hard to operate. And here it is. This is the moment. The trap opens.
The jaws of the trap.
The seller hears that implied need and instantly gets a dopamine hit. They think, aha, I found the pain. It's a buying signal. And the seller immediately says, oh, we can absolutely solve that. Our new system is entirely automated and incredibly easy for operators to use. Boom. Trap sprung. Deal dead.
And the inexperienced seller is completely bewildered when the buyer starts pushing back. But if we go back to our value equation, that mental scale we talked about earlier, we can see exactly why this trap is fatal.
What's actually happening on the scale?
Well, what has this seller actually just done? They have attempted to balance a massive, expensive, highly disruptive, risky new system against a very minor, completely undeveloped complaint that the machines are rather hard to operate.
The scale is completely broken.
Shattered.
You are sitting across from a plant manager, asking them to spend $1 million, freeze their capital expenditure budget for the entire year, rip out heavy machinery, and fight with their union over retraining. All just to solve the fact that a machine is rather hard to operate. The cognitive dissonance is just deafening.
The buyer is sitting there silently doing that mental math. They are weighing the immense hassle and risk of your solution. And because the solution is so heavy and the problem you uncovered is so ridiculously light, the equation does not balance.
It doesn't even come close.
Right. And so the buyer's psychological defense mechanisms immediately engage to protect the status quo. And the really fascinating thing about human behavior is how they protect it. They will instantly begin minimizing their own problem.
They actually walk back their own complaint. They'll say, well, I mean, it's not that hard to operate. The guys are used to it.
We've got a good manual.
Yeah, we figure it out. Or they throw up a budget smokescreen, like, we just don't have the funds right now. They raise an objection, not because they don't have a problem, but because you, the seller, have not made the problem big enough to justify the absolute nightmare of fixing it.
It's such a critical realization. If we synthesize everything we've unpacked today, from the illusion of the buying signal in large transactions, to the heavy reality of the value equation, to the fatigue caused by overusing situation questions, and finally the deadly trap of stopping at problem questions.
It all coalesces into one singular overriding insight.
It does. And that insight is that the fundamental difference between an amateur and a master in a major negotiation is simply the discipline of patience.
Patience. The amateur rushes to be the hero.
Always.
The amateur hears a tiny squeak of pain and throws a massive $1 million solution at it, hoping the sheer brilliance of their product will win the day. But the master hears the pain and stays in the problem.
Because success in large-scale influence isn't about pitching your solution beautifully. It isn't about having, the slickest ROI calculator or the most charismatic stage presence.
Right.
It's about shifting the burden of realization to the buyer. It is the patient, methodical work of taking their vague annoyances, their minor complaints, those implied needs, and developing them until they become urgent, undeniable demands for action.
Your entire job is to help the buyer stack weights on the left side of that value equation.
Exactly. Until the seriousness of their problem vastly, undeniably outweighs the cost of your solution.
So you've done your prep work, you've asked your situation questions quickly and cleanly, you've asked your problem questions tactfully, expertly navigating their ego, you've finally uncovered the raw material of a problem.
You've got the clay.
Right, you have the clay. And thanks to today's deep dive, you absolutely cannot pitch your solution yet. You have to bite your tongue.
So hard.
So, what do you do next? How exactly do you take a passing comment about a machine being hard to use and make it feel like an existential threat to their business that justifies a massive purchase?
That's the $1 million question.
And how do you do it without terrifying or offending them in the process? Well, that's where the real magic happens. That's where we get to the I and the N of SPC, implication and need-payoff questions, which we are going to explore next time.
I can't wait. Those two question types are the turning point of every successful major negotiation. They are exactly how you build that weight.
So as we wrap up, I want you to think about the biggest deal, the most important negotiation, or the highest stakes pitch you are preparing for right now. What if the most persuasive, powerful thing you can do for your customer tomorrow isn't showing them how brilliant your solution is, but gently, patiently helping them realize just how much their current problem is already costing them?
What you just listened was the beginning of a full audio, way longer, explaining every single chapter of the book. If you would like to keep listening to the end and access to the full audio, you can access it with the link down below in the description and in the pinned comment.